I want to welcome you all to the Oceans panel. I'm Simi Payne. I'm the Associate Director for the California Center for Environmental Law and Policy and the Director of our Global Commons Project, which deals with global commons like oceans, amongst other things. And I'm going to be very brief, but it's my enormous pleasure to introduce the panel chair, Professor Harry Scheiber. Professor Scheiber is a distinguished member of the Bolt faculty and has been since 1980. He teaches our courses and seminars in American legal history, American federalism, coastal and ocean law and policy, and jurisprudence and social policy. He is a very distinguished scholar in all those fields, and I guess I'll just mention, to keep this very brief, that he earned his degrees in history at Cornell University, that he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and that he is, probably most germane to this panel, the co-director of the Law of the Sea Institute, which has co-sponsors this panel, and which we are very pleased has found its home at Bolt, although it is an organization with international jurisdiction, shall we say. So, Professor Scheiber.
Thanks very much, Simi. Thank you very much. My own introductions of the others are going to be very brief because I'm looking around, everyone has a badge, which means everyone has a program, and you've had an opportunity to read about our distinguished speakers without long introductions. It's really a great pleasure to be here and an honor, and the Law of the Sea Institute is principally concerned with, as I always say, needling Rick Frank and Simi, we're blue water people, but it's misleading. Indeed, back in the 1960s, at the time of the Stratton Commission, there was a lot of interest in the interrelationship of coastal issues and and the larger question of the oceans, ocean science. But there was a pretty strong distinction. Nonetheless, California pioneered in the development of the concept of a coastal zone, and of a coastal zone that would involve the management of onshore terrestrial resources, the management of point-based pollution, the relationship to the larger ocean questions such as fisheries, undersea mining, and so on. 1965, there was an effort at interagency cooperation in Sacramento. That seemed like a very advanced and pioneering thing at the time, to actually bring together people from the various agencies who were concerned with ocean and coastal resources. But it was a dream, really, shared by only a few visionaries that there could ever be such a thing as we have today in the Ocean Protection Council, and the kind of coherence and support for an understanding of coastal and ocean issues and their interrelationship. This was something hardly foreseen as a political possibility 40 years ago, when the concept of coastal zone was emerging, and a California report that Milner Schaefer of Scripps directed in the work of Wilbur Chapman, who was a scientist, a fishery scientist and the director of the American Tuna Boat Association, and a distinguished member of the Law of the Sea negotiations team that was over a long period of time, over 20 years, developing the Law of the Sea Treaty. Just one last word on that. In that regard, the connection was seen by Don McKernan, who was President Nixon's chief person in the State Department, Nixon and then Ford, called the Assistant Secretary for Wildlife and Fisheries. He had responsibility for ocean affairs. And I was just looking this morning through some correspondence that I'd used of his in my research, historical research on these subjects. There's a fascinating letter in 1970 in which he's having an exchange with the State Department, in which he says, look, when we're going to look at Law of the Sea, we're going to have to take account of the fact that coastal zone management is coming, and it's going to be global. And you can't look at blue water questions any longer the way we have for the last 200 years, It's an interrelationship that's intimate, that's going to affect every policy consideration, both onshore and offshore, and we have to look in that direction. Well, California has looked in that direction more consistently and with greater success than almost any other state in the union, and it's a model. So it's in that sense, it's not only a pleasure, but it has a special significance that our first speaker today is Drew Bohan, who is the Executive Policy Officer for the Ocean Protection Council. And I'm very happy to have him as our first speaker.
Well, thanks very much, Harry. I also want to thank Rick Frank in the back. I had the distinct pleasure of working with Rick on the environmental law section of the state bar, and I think you've got an ideal person in place here to run this program, and Simi as well, and so thanks very much for having me. I have a tall order. I've got to get, I think by my notes here, 4 things across. Keep you awake after lunch is number 1. 2, frame the issues we're going to talk about today generally. 3, talk specifically about climate change a bit, which is the one I got asked to talk about and how it impacts the ocean. And finally, although not in this order, describe the Ocean Protection Council very briefly for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So I thought, I have hundreds and hundreds of slides, and I thought before this presentation, how do I, in 8 minutes now, 8.5, how do I get a group of largely students, I can imagine you're not all students, but largely students sort of engaged, and I thought, well, let's start with a quiz and an arresting quote. So my first slide is a quote. I understand this is on the web, so I'll read it. People can read, but I'll just read it. Okay, who said this quote? Human beings in the natural world are on a collision course. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future that we wish for human society and the plant and animal kingdoms, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. Anybody know where this comes from? Show of hands. What's that? Darwin. Interesting. Anyone else? I thought I'd get a Greenpeace guess or something like that, an environmental group. This is from the Rio Summit in 1992, and it was a statement, which is much longer than this, signed on by 1,500 of the top world scientists and half of all living Nobel laureates in the sciences. So when you read something like this and you say, wait a minute, may alter the living world so much that we may not be able to sustain life in the way we know it, it's a pretty dramatic quote. So there's also an oceans piece that, do I just hit enter? Yeah, which goes on and on, but I thought I'd just throw this first piece up, which says destructive pressure on the oceans is severe, particularly in the coastal regions which produce most of the world's food fish. And it does go on at some length. So with that in mind, this big picture set of threats, I wanted to suggest that's where the scientists are in this issue. The media has picked up on this, and we've seen in the last several years a couple lead stories in 2 of the top weeklies. And the policy experts as well weighed in 2003 and 4. These are 2 documents, one from Pew Oceans Commission and another from the Commission on Ocean Policy. And they had very dramatic statements about the way we really need to change the way, mainly, we manage our approach to ocean resources. And from this document came the Ocean Protection Council. Governor Schwarzenegger signed in 2004 the Ocean Protection Act. This is our 5-year strategic plan. It's on the web, very easy to find if anyone is interested in looking at it. But we were formed to really try to take on some of these issues and say, well, why are we doing so dismally based on what we're hearing from people who've spent, in the case of the policy experts, better than a year going around the country asking folks what they thought the problems were, and of course the scientific community. And briefly, we're made up of very high-level folks. We've got the Secretary of Resources, Mike Christman, Linda Adams at Cal EPA. These are both governor's appointees. John Chung, our chair of state lands, and that position goes back and forth between the controller, John Chung, and the lieutenant governor. So we just lost the lieutenant governor, having had him for a year on our body. We'll get him back in another year. They switch every year who the chair is. We also have a couple, a senator and an assembly member, Darrell Steinberg and Pedro Nava, and finally 2 public members, former mayor of San Diego, Susan Golding, and the current executive director of the Port of LA, Geraldine Natz. And again, our principal charge is to try to take on specific big issues, shine light on them, and then more internally work with all the agencies who have responsibility for managing ocean resources. And that includes the obvious ones, but also Maureen across the hall is speaking on toxics issues. She's with Department of Toxic Substances Control. She's also on my, essentially, advisory board. wanted to talk briefly before getting into climate change about the big problems. This is from E.O. Wilson. He puts everything into these first 4 categories that he calls HIPPO. If you haven't read E.O. Wilson, he's an entomologist from Harvard, and I think one of the great spokespersons for how life systems work, or as he's been illuminating lately, don't work so well. And he calls it HIPPO, and it's habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, and overharvesting. And I add in global climate change because I think he came up with this before this was an issue that's resonated so strongly with so many of us. And some of what I want to talk about in a few minutes is fairly abstract. So I wanted to start with kind of a concrete example and another quiz, given that we're in an education environment. The only place we can find this animal anymore, unfortunately, since 1922 is on our flag. And our hope is that we don't see otters or orangs or gorillas or great giant fish that used to be all over, particularly Southern California, and now you're lucky to spot one in Catalina, gone. And finally, salmon. That picture I doctored a little bit to make the fish look bigger. The prior one I didn't. That's really a legit picture. I only try to shape it a little bit better. Salmon we have real big problems with, and this is climate change has an impact, but I think I'll avoid going into this too much and move on, but this might be something we want to talk about because I think it's a great sentinel species for the problems we're facing, both due to climate change and sort of the land-sea connection we talk about a lot. So what I wanted to talk about is climate change for a few minutes and then move to our other panelists, and really we want to get you engaged and take questions. These are 2 slides that the governor used, and they're blown up each about the size of this screen here when he kicked off his position on climate change. This happens to be in Austria, which makes sense. It's the Pasteurs Glacier. And within a span of 100 years, the first picture is 1875, the second 2004, just over a century, we've seen dramatic changes. And anyone who's seen Al Gore's movie or paid attention, frankly, in the last year has seen slides like this. But I think it's quite arresting. The big issues, I think, in the ocean are acidification, which I'm not going to spend too much time on, but the concern, of course, is a lot of things, but particularly the critters like this. A pteropod will literally, their exoskeletons won't be able to form properly, and they're at the base of the food chain. This could cause serious problems for all of us. Second, regime shifts. And I put 3 slides up here that I found, and I have no idea what any of them mean, but I found them looking under a search of regime shifts in the ocean, and I thought, they illustrate a good point in it, and that is we don't really have any idea what's going on, and we have no idea what to expect, but we know there's lots of possibilities that aren't really very good. And so with that, I'll move into something we know a little bit more about, and this is a graph that I could actually understand a little bit. And this just shows what we know about sea level rise over the last century or so, and the expectation in the next century or so. And our California Energy Commission is working feverishly on updating this scenario. And I talked 2 days ago to the fella, Guido Franco, who's really running this issue for, is that Guido? Hi, Guido. We've only spoken on the phone and haven't met. And I promised him I wouldn't use the numbers he told me. He said sea level rise is maybe in the next 10 years going to go, did you say 100 feet, was it? But I promised I wouldn't cite particular figures. No, seriously, the figures suggest that the numbers are likely to be higher, but Guido and his team are really working out the kinks, and so it is a little early to say that. But we know that it's going to go up seriously and significantly, and I want to just show a few slides that help illustrate what things look like today, and we can only imagine what they might look like in the future. This is Monterey Bay, and maybe by 2100, we're going to have a bridge that takes us over a moat to get to this hotel in the bay. This is just a storm surge that is going to be exacerbated by sea level rise. We're defending our structures in lots of places, and this has both good and bad. And then our big infrastructure that's probably not going anywhere real soon, like the airport. This is from BCDC, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and it just shows what 3 feet, a meter actually, of sea level rise would look like for the San Francisco airport, the light blue being water, if we don't defend it. So what we're trying to do at Ocean Protection Council is step back a little bit, work with the agencies who have primary responsibility for dealing with these issues, and saying, what are we going to do? How do we want to try to look forward 100 years and start setting some policies in place now that will get us ready for what may come? We're not going to be involved in mitigation. That's just not something the ocean managers are going to have much to do with. We've got, fortunately, the governor, probably the world leader on climate change, establishing an entire team devoted to that, and that's probably more important, frankly, but on our side, how are we going to deal with what we expect the consequences to be? And I invite any discussion or any comments folks have, or if you want to send emails, and I mean this seriously, we get a lot of our best ideas from folks who think about this stuff a lot and bring ideas to us. And then I got a whole bunch of slides, but I think, I'll just zip through them, and those on the web won't be able to see them, but I'll close with some nice slides. I just had a daughter, so I had to put that in. This is how much the ocean economy is in California. And we caught Rick Frank in a moment here on the beach, and that's the end of my show. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Drew. Our next speaker is Kathryn Mengerink, who is a graduate of Bolt and who is now with and also a graduate of the Scripps Institution. Oh, Joel, I'm sorry. You changed the order? Did I miss? Give me a second here. Oh, well, you're down for second. You want to talk next, Joel?
Doesn't matter, actually. I'm perfectly happy to go third.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead with Kathryn. Kathryn Mengerink is a graduate of this institution, of the Scripps Institution, from which she holds a doctorate in marine biology, and has been engaged in the building up of a very important program in coastal and ocean matters for the Environmental Law Institute based in Washington. She is based at Scripps. And it's a special pleasure, of course, to have her come back to her home here. And we don't have an office for you anymore, sorry. She was a collaborator in the Law of the Sea Institute project on IUU fishing, which is finally culminating this month in a couple of publications, and has contributed very importantly to activities in the University of California and in the California coastal and ocean community generally. So welcome, Kathryn, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
The shorter person on the panel. I'd just like to say thank you to Professor Scheiber, who really, it's because of him that I went back to oceans after bailing on science, and when I came to law school, and also to both Simi and Rick for inviting me to participate on this panel. I wanted to talk today about a project that we've been working on and a concept which is ecosystem-based management. And let me just do a time check to make sure. Oh, actually, I can keep track of the time that way. Can you see over the top of me? Is that? So ecosystem-based management, I wanted to talk about what that is, what that means for the ocean, and what direction it's heading. And at this point, from a legal sort of litigation perspective, ecosystem-based management isn't there yet. But from a management perspective, I think it's important and is changing the way that we envision how to manage our coasts, which the California Ocean Protection Council is a good example of that. So let me just back up and talk about some of the issues and the need for ecosystem-based management. We can all appreciate looking at our favorite neighborhood and how it's changed over time, that we've seen a shift from open space to greater development, and each individual activity kind of changing the overall landscape. And then when we look back at historical pictures, we have enormous change that's happened over time. The same thing is happening in the ocean, but we don't appreciate it as much because we look out into the ocean and we go, wow, it's pretty out there. Unless there's oil and gas structures in place or something that's really vividly a change in the scenery, it looks pretty much the same unless you're working in it, seeing it, and for the most part, we don't have the same kind of information about what's happening in the ocean. But that's not to say that there's not enormous impacts that are occurring, both across time and space, and from different sectors. So we have fisheries that are impacting the resource. Shipping moves invasive species and expands the spread of invasive species. We have land-based activities and changes in terms of what's coming out of our freshwater streams and what's being from runoff, and that's changing the type of pollution that's in the ocean and the dynamics there. Coastal development, agriculture, oil and gas, all of these things that are happening on our ocean, and slowly ticking away and making changes, fundamental changes to the biodiversity that we have and the ecosystems that we have there. On the horizon for California and for the rest of the U.S., as we look at climate change and how to mitigate the effects of climate change, we're looking at wave development, and this is something that's real and happening along the Pacific. There's liquefied natural gas ports, desalination, increases in shipping, and then the impacts of climate change. So all of these things are coming together to cause an effect on the ocean. But in terms of management, we're still dealing with things in a single sector by sector basis. I think that one of the best examples right now of the need for ecosystem-based management is the salmon crisis that's happening in California right now. We have, in 2002, there were 775,000 adult salmon coming back to spawn in the Sacramento River. This year, they expect 58,000. So it's a tenfold decline. And what are the reasons for that? According to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, that it's due to natural factors, or they are saying that biologists think that the salmon decline is due to natural factors. It's due to in-stream withdrawals, habitat alterations, dams, construction, pollution, and changes in hatchery operations. And if you'll listen to that list, fishing wasn't among those, although certainly fishing pressure is an important piece of this. But it also recognizes that there's a lot of things that are causing the decline of salmon. What's the solution for the Pacific Fisheries Management Council? The only solution that they have is to reduce salmon fishing pressure, which raises two issues. One is an issue of fairness. Is it fair to burden the fishing community only? If they're are they the only recourse is to reduce fishing and hope then that the salmon come back? And secondly, if we just reduce fishing pressure, is that going to solve the problem? If we have all these other impacts, is just reducing fishing pressure going to be the solution to the problem? My guess is probably not. Or maybe it'll take care of part of it. You'll see a partial rebound, but will you see another 775,000 salmon? And my guess that's even reduced in terms of historical levels. And this challenge sort of encapsulates this challenge that EBM seeks to address, or ecosystem-based management. I tend to call it EBM, so that's the lingo. And how do we, so the question is, how do we manage ocean and coastal health, considering these cumulative impacts that are occurring across time and across space and across sectors? And this requires us to consider explicit and transparent trade-offs. So we've been making trade-offs all along about how we use our resource and whether or not we're going to conserve our resource. But ultimately what needs to happen is an explicit consideration and a transparent consideration of the trade-offs that we need to make about our ocean and the uses that the potentially, or the competing uses that are out there right now. And in looking in terms of the future, I think it's going to be one of our great challenges is to figure out how to deal with this issue of trade-offs. And so the vision of ecosystem-based management then is based, and as my former advisor, Professor Scheiber, will tell you, is not a new phenomenon or is not a new idea, but it's been revised and has been fleshed out recently. And the best and most comprehensive definition that we have right now for marine ecosystem-based management is can be found with the scientific consensus statement on ecosystem-based management that was signed by over 200 scientists and policymakers. And it articulates 9 core elements of ecosystem-based management. It calls for making and protecting and restoring marine ecosystems and all of their services the primary focus for management. It should consider cumulative effects of different activities on the diversity and interactions of species. It should facilitate connectivity among and within ecosystems. It should incorporate measures that acknowledge inherent uncertainties, so this idea of the precautionary approach. It should create complementary and coordinated policies at global, international, national, and regional and local scales. The idea is that the ocean is not a contained area, that the environment is interconnected. We should maintain historical levels of native biodiversity, and in many instances, we don't know what that is. Only in very few cases do we have a sense of what historical levels of biodiversity are. And it requires that evidence that an action will not cause harm, undue harm to ecosystem functioning. This is back to the precautionary approach. Another principle is to develop multiple indicators so that there's a need to be based in rigorous science in terms of indicators of measuring the ecosystem functioning, the service provisions, and effectiveness of management efforts, and to involve stakeholders in this participatory governance process. That's it. I mean, that's all we have to do, right? I think that in individual sectors, there are ecosystem approaches that are already out there. You can look, for example, at water quality management, and in some situations you see in some states there's the watershed approach. And this is an ecosystem approach within a single sector. Within fisheries managements, there's efforts now, fisheries-based, let's see, EBFM, ecosystem-based fisheries management. And that's the idea that you're considering multiple different species interactions when you're managing your fishery. But that's still a single sector approach. Ecosystem-based management as a whole tries to integrate across these different sectors. And for us, the question for governance from a legal perspective is how do we do that in a real way? To date, the approach has really been one of regional governance and the development, if we look at the examples that we have right now, the development of advisory boards and committees that serve a planning function, and certainly that's an important piece of it. There's a development of a plan and a vision for a specific ecosystem, and then typically the individual agencies or actors that are involved in the development of this plan are individually tasked with carrying out the plan. For the most part, it's been, and I'm over my time, for the most part it's been focused on restoration and research, and not on real-time management of the activities and the future activities of the environment. And I think that's where things need to change in terms of ecosystem-based management, that we really need to address and minimize the cumulative impacts. And I think that's the big challenge for us, is to try to figure out how to develop assessments that, first of all, to have an ecosystem assessment of the ocean that tells us or has some type of prediction of what's going to happen under different scenarios of development, and then have cumulative impact assessments that actually consider these different sectors and the interrelationship of these different sectors. I think I'm over my time, and maybe we'll reserve additional conversation for the discussion section. Another big piece of this is how we're going to make trade-off decisions among these competing uses. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Thank you very much. Introducing our next speaker is a little intimidating for me. I started my own interest in environmental involvement in environmental affairs goes back to the second year of Environmental Defense Fund, when I was consultant on a case back in Connecticut. And in and out of the practice over the years, all of it pro bono, including my current work as an advisor to the Joint Oceans Commission, and recently appointed to Mr. Bohan's Commission Scientific Task Force. But then I look at what our next speaker has done in a sustained effort, decade after decade. Not that you're 90 years old, but for almost 30 years, Jolla Reynolds has played a very important role in the litigation of high-profile, very important cases in the field of environmental law, community rights, and other aspects of environmental questions. Most lately and most prominently in recent days or weeks, his work with regard to the Navy sonar project and the litigation of that issue. And so I welcome Jolla Reynolds. Having mentioned your awesome career, I'm hopeful that when you're done, that we'll be able to discuss all the issues that are raised by these speakers, and I look forward to hearing you on your questions. Thank you, Joel. Please.
Thank you very much. I prefer to just...
Okay, I'll shut this so it doesn't pick up.
Does this work? Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, Professor Scheiber, and also to Rick Frank and Simi Payne for this opportunity to come and speak. I have basically been a litigator for about 28 years now, and so I come at these issues from a different perspective. I've done some international campaigning and other kinds of advocacy, but basically what I like to do is to pick fights with people, with polluters, and pursue them, hopefully to a successful conclusion. I'm going to talk very briefly about two of the biggest battles I'm engaged in at the moment, matters that I find particularly interesting and really raise for me the fundamental point that I think people need to think about today, as our environmental problems are perhaps more daunting than ever. I think it's fundamental that we have to begin as a society to think about how to do things differently if we're going to survive as a society. One of the questions I always pose is, imagine yourselves 500 years in the future and ask what people living at that time will care about in terms of what we did today. And I think there's probably no better answer than that they will care about what we did to give them a healthy world. That everything else will pale in comparison to that. Livable cities, natural environment, vibrant species, living oceans, habitable climate. All of these things we have to take seriously and perhaps deal with in a way that we simply haven't done very well over the past century. And I think the two issues I want to touch on today really illustrate this fact. The first is probably the worst project in all of California today, and perhaps in my entire career, never have I seen a more stupid project. And this is a proposal to build a 6-lane toll road through the 5th most popular state park in California, the state park at San Onofre State Beach. How many have heard of this? I'm just curious. Very good. That means we're making some progress. This sounds like a really dumb idea, but it is one of the more difficult projects that I've ever fought. It's because the agency that is proposing this miserable road is a freak of bad governance created by the legislature. It's a bunch of Orange County municipalities that exist for one purpose, and that is to build toll roads. That's all. They don't care whether the projects are good or not. They don't really care fundamentally whether they deal with the traffic problem. They just want to build the toll roads. And so far they've done a pretty good job, but this last one, I think they may actually have hit a brick wall because of the fundamental problems with it. This is not just going to destroy this park, which serves, by the way, 2.5 million people every year. At the base of this park is Trestles, which is one of the world-class surfing areas that we have in this country. It is home to 11 threatened and endangered species. It is itself an endangered species along the Southern California coast because there simply aren't any areas for people to go other than this one. So if you can imagine a very thin letter, capital letter A, the top inland, the feet of the A being right at the coast, that's what this park basically looks like. And they've designed this road to go from the top of the park down right through the spine of it to the base and then to hook into Interstate 5. If you wanted to design a road to do more damage to this park, you couldn't have done a better job. It's not a toll road through a park, it's a toll road instead of a park. And so there are 3 lawsuits against it. I've filed one of them. The Attorney General has filed one on behalf of the State Parks Commission, and another one on behalf of the Native American Heritage Commission because it disturbs sacred sites. The California Coastal Commission in early February, after a 14-hour hearing attended by by over 3,500 people, the largest I've ever seen, voted 8-2 to reject it, and now the Toll Road Agency has appealed it, as so many bad actors do, to the Bush administration to overturn it. And that's basically where it stands. Now, one of the interesting things about this, it's a mystery to me, you've probably heard a lot of very good things justifiably about our governor at this conference because of his leadership on climate, but he supports this road. And I absolutely find it mystifying because this is the kind of project that represents everything that got us into the trouble that we're in today on this planet. It will perpetuate our oil addiction. It will destroy natural habitat. It won't really do anything to solve the traffic problem, and yet Governor Schwarzenegger, has come down on the side of this toll road agency for reasons that, as far as I can tell, have nothing to do with anything except pure politics and pandering to Orange County Republicans, who are the only ones who support this road. Now, it isn't just that it's kind of an interesting story, and I'm not going to go much further with it because I don't have time. But basically, he has turned his resources agency into a proponent for this. Mike Chrisman, who is the czar of our wildlife in this state, has had to come down in support of this project. Caltrans, which builds the roads in the state, has refused even to look at alternatives because there are better traffic alternatives in this project. The governor recently terminated Clint Eastwood and Bobby Schreiber, the vice chair and the chair of the State Parks Commission, respectively, because they had come out against this project. I mean, it's just not a sensible story. And this is a governor who believes that we have to begin to deal with climate. And yet, for whatever reasons, when the rubber meets the road on this kind of a project, he's in the wrong place. And I find it enormously disappointing, inexplicable, and really, really too bad. But we're fighting this project with everything that we're worth, not just NRDC, but every single major environmental organization has taken this project on as a first-level priority. We will fight this till the death, if that's what it takes, because we just can't do this anymore. We simply can't do this anymore. And if there's any project that violates every single one of those ecosystem-based management principles that Kathryn just articulated, it's this one. So this is, I think, a prime example of how we have to do things differently. Now, let me just talk briefly about sonar, which is just a fascinating issue. I usually give a talk of about 2 hours. I'm going to do it in 5 minutes now. This is relates to the growing international problem of acoustic pollution. Some of you may know something about it. It's basically, there are a bunch of activities that humans engage in that generate sound that is so loud it's less like sound than just a physical force. If you put your hand up in front of one of these sonar devices a foot away, it would rip the skin off of your hand. This is sound that has been established beyond any shadow of scientific doubt to cause whales to bleed internally, internal organs to explode and cause mass strandings around the world, something that originally wasn't well understood but increasingly has become so. NRDC has been working on this. Well, it's not just military activities. It's sound used for oil exploration, high-energy seismic surveys, which involve very large air cannons that are towed around back and forth over areas where they're looking for oil for periods of weeks, even months at a time, every 6.5 to 12 seconds, blasting a low-frequency explosion in the range of about 250 decibels, which is, you get any louder than that and you basically boil water. So, and then it's the problem of shipping. There are 50 to 80,000 supertankers plying the oceans at any one time, generating sound in the neighborhood of 192 decibels, creating this ubiquitous hum in the oceans 24 hours a day. The oceans are an acoustic environment because sound travels very efficiently in water, far more efficiently than in air, 5 times more efficiently. Light does not penetrate far beneath the surface, so you have species that over eons have evolved to rely on sound the way that we rely on sight. They need to be able to hear and be heard to find mates, to find food, to breed, to migrate. Just about anything that is significant to survival relates to sound. And as we increase the level of anthropogenic noise in the ocean, we are basically shrinking their world because we are preventing them from hearing and being heard in the way that they need to survive. Let me just give you one example, a blue whale. That's the largest animal in the history of the planet, larger than the largest dinosaurs. They have been shown to communicate. You have a blue whale down around Puerto Rico communicating with a blue whale up off the coast of Canada, and probably talking about, where the food is or where the mates are or whatever. But as you begin to increase the ambient noise level in the ocean, that has an enormous impact in terms of shrinking the area in which sound can be heard by these animals. And there are many, many examples of that. NRDC began to take on, in particular, military sonar, because that was a source, that was an activity that we could reach through the legal system, through litigation in this country. And since 1994, I've filed, I don't know, 6 or 7 cases against the U.S. Navy, starting with underwater explosives off the Southern California coast, and then getting into sonar as we began to learn more and more about these acoustic issues. And we've dealt with a low-frequency active sonar system that was approved for deployment over 75% of the oceans. We've dealt with sonar in the mid-frequency range off Hawaii, off Southern California, and we have a large case now dealing with the use of mid-frequency sonar around the globe. Now, mid-frequency is particularly challenging. It doesn't go as far as low-frequency sound, but it's the principal submarine detection system for the U.S. Navy, and in fact, a lot of other navies in the world. So, whereas the low-frequency active sonar system was a new generation, it was a sort of a new technological development in the evolution of this kind of system. Mid-frequency sonar is very much at the core of our of what the Pentagon views as our national security system. And so they have fought us tooth and nail on this. The most high-profile case is one involving Southern California. It's a 2-year program for sonar training exercises off the Southern California coast, near the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. These waters are among the most biologically rich anywhere in the world. Some 35 species of marine mammals, many of which are threatened and endangered, 5 species of endangered whales. It happens to be an area where the Navy historically has liked to do a lot of its training exercises, and so we have now taken them on in this area because you've got a technology, mid-frequency sonar, which has been established as the cause of mass strandings of whales around the world now for decades. Most recently, about a month ago, a mass stranding off the Hebrides has been associated with this. That's just the most recent. But the Navy didn't do an environmental impact statement. They exempted themselves from the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And they did some compliance under the Endangered Species Act. They went to the California Coastal Commission for approval under the Coastal Zone Management Act. They were denied approval. And so they basically said to the Coastal Commission, whatever kind of mitigation you want us to do, we won't do it because we don't recognize your jurisdiction to regulate this kind of activity. And this is a matter of national security. So NRDC and a series of groups we represent took them to court. We got a preliminary injunction last August blocking any training with sonar. They took an immediate appeal to the Ninth Circuit and got a motions panel to stay that injunction at the end of August. We then got a merits panel that in early November lifted the stay and reinstated the injunction in the middle of November, but remanded to the district court to sharpen its injunction so that the Navy could train, but would do so in a more environmentally responsible way by incorporating a whole bunch of mitigation. Geographic mitigation and non-geographic. So operational limits and then just staying out of certain areas. So then it really got interesting because in mid-January, the Navy went to the Bush administration literally to get the president to intervene to override the court's order, both under the National Environmental Policy Act and under the Coastal Zone Management Act, something that had never been done before. And true to his form, Bush signed the piece of paper and attempted to do it. So this created, a new media profile for this case like nothing we'd ever seen before. It wasn't anymore just about the environment and military sonar. This was a case about whether we have an imperial president. Because this was a pattern for the Bush administration in so many different areas, as we all know. But So the case became quite interesting. They tried to get to the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit kicked it back down. Really what the Navy wanted to do was get to the Supreme Court as fast as they could with as little record as could be developed. So the Ninth Circuit said, no, we're not going to look at this until the district court does. So it went back down to the district court. In early February, the district court rejected the waivers, upheld its own injunction, and then it went right back up to the Ninth Circuit. And no sooner had it gone to the Ninth Circuit than the court on its own issued a sua sponte order that said, we're not just going to deal with this on an emergency motion basis. We're going to expedite the entire appeal, and we will complete the appeal by the end of February. Because the next exercise the Navy had planned was the middle of March. And this really frustrated the Navy because they were hoping that the Ninth Circuit would deny the emergency motion for a stay of the district court's injunction so that they could get right up to Tony Kennedy, who's the circuit justice, who would then be able to kind of on his own, without much of a developed record at all, decide this issue, either on the merits under NEPA or on this question of whether the president had the authority to do what the Navy said he did. So then, 2 days after oral argument, on the 29th of February, the Court of Appeals issued a 108-page opinion, virtually an encyclopedic treatment of military sonar and the environment, rejecting the Bush waivers, affirming the preliminary injunction, and basically giving the Navy a partial stay of some of the mitigation to enable them to petition for cert, which they have now done. They did that about a week or so ago. And so that's where it now stands. It's an extremely interesting case. You know, the court doesn't take that many cases of all the cases that come to it. So on that basis, you would think that the cert petition wouldn't stand, you know, a huge chance of success. The problem is, I think the number when the Solicitor General actually requests it is 45% success rate. So there's, I think, a reasonably good shot that the Supreme Court would take this case. That wouldn't be good for us, probably. I don't think for sure we would lose, because I think on the merits we've got a very strong case. And I am out of time, so I can't say more about it now, but if there are more questions, I can give you more details. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joel. Well, the last two papers have given us an example of how political pressures and economic pressures often come into direct confrontation with scientific imperatives or perceived scientific imperatives. Our first paper indicated the efforts that are being made to develop an independent scientific and planning perspective. And we've had a view from the NGO world, and a view from the governmental world, and a view from the world of litigation. I think we have about 25 minutes. I'd like to give the first 3 or 4 minutes to the speakers to ask each other a question or make a comment if they would like, and then we'll open the floor to all of you. So I start with you, Drew. Is there anything you'd like to add or query?
Sure, I guess these are all on. I'll go and ask Kathryn, because she and I have debated this issue for a long time, so we might as well make it public here. The question on EBM, the concern some people have expressed is, it sounds very attractive, but how do we convert this notion of implicit in ecosystem-based management is we're not doing a very good job, and that was stipulated by a lot of folks in the presentation I gave. But how do we do all these things? A lot of the verbs that are used in the language are thinking about things and considering things and that sort of stuff. How do we actually get people that wake up every day with a fairly narrow mission to do these types of things?
Yeah, we have had this conversation, and Drew has posed to me, so what do we do differently? I think that, for me, you can look at all of the parameters of ecosystem-based management. It says do more research, do more holding hands, and collaborate some more, and fine. There's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of planning that goes on. And what does that get us? I think it gets us some really great plans, but that doesn't necessarily get us implementation. And I think that the conclusion, we've been working on this project for over a year now, and the vision that we're really seeing is sort of a twofold thing. One is that we need a solid ecosystem assessment. We need a solid understanding of what our marine environment is, because at this point in time, we really don't have a good understanding of what's happening and just, I mean, basic biology. You can go into a forest and you'll know the species in most forests, or, for the most part, we know terrestrial biology. But if you look at the ocean, one of the people I work with, I'm down based at Scripps, and they went off of La Jolla, off of Scripps Pier, went diving and discovered 5 new species. And that's our level of knowledge about the ocean right now. It's just not the same level, and it's because it's hard to get to and expensive. So there's an important piece of just simply understanding. And one of the things that we've thought about as a real need is for there to be the type of science-based institutions that focus on coastal management that we have for fisheries management. So for fisheries management, we have fisheries science centers that, and federal money is spent on understanding fisheries, but we don't have that same type of center for collecting information to manage the coastal zone, so the type of applied research that's needed. And I think the second step then is to tie this ecosystem assessment to permitting decisions. I mean, so we can do restoration, we can concentrate restoration efforts on the idea of conserving specific pieces of the ecosystem, but I think that if we're going to get at this issue of how to move into the future and protect the environment in a way that's going to end up with cohesive ecosystems for the ocean, that the decisions that have to be made, for people who are applying to do something new in the ocean, or for people who are trying to develop the coastal zone where impacts are going to be cumulative on the environment, that's where we need to be actually implementing ecosystem-based management. And I think that the way to do that then is to develop methods for cumulative impact assessments that are meaningful and that take advantage of this knowledge base that we have. And so then the next thing is, well, we don't have a lot of information about the ocean, how do we do it? And I think that that's where the precautionary approach applies, that we need to say, we will allow development of the ocean in this area if you have enough information to demonstrate that it's not going to do harm. And I think that's where the change needs to occur.
Yeah.
I'd like to follow up on that, because that's a very interesting area for Kathryn. Do you think that there's a conflict between science and the precautionary principle? And more specifically, for scientists who get involved in issues like ecosystem-based management and permitting decisions, does that put them in a position that is somehow contrary to their training and their discipline, particularly when you begin to think about the role of the precautionary principle?
I think that's, and I'm not sure that I quite understand your question, but I think that, let me see if I can answer it anyways. I think that scientists often don't want to be in a position of making a policy decision. So they say, oh, well, we want to give you the scientific facts, and then you make the decision. And I think that that is a challenge, and it will continue to be one. In terms of the precautionary approach, I guess I'm not, maybe you could help me.
Yeah, I can. I'll give you just a specific example. In my experience, there are scientists sometimes are comfortable in the public policy arena, and sometimes they're not. Fundamentally, it is a myth to say that there's one scientific answer.
Right.
There are always different ways to read data.
Right.
And so from the environmental side, we believe it's very important to rely upon the precautionary principle, particularly in areas where you have we have data gaps, and you have uncertainties. But I find in dealing with some scientists that they somehow view that as antithetical to what they do for a living, which is to say to do research, objectively identify facts and data, and then that will dictate an answer. My own experience has been that science doesn't really do that for you in a lot of these very complicated ocean conservation issues, or even land conservation, same problem. It will inform a public policy decision, but it will never make that decision for you because there are other considerations that go into that process, including the precautionary principle.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that scientists often want to understand completely before making a kind of guiding policy in a certain direction, and that there's often a big gap in terms of timing. That we can collect information and collect more information, and you still have more questions about whether or not a decision is, taking one path or another path is the right one. And I think it is. It becomes a policy decision, and I think that the solution then is twofold. One is that we make explicit decisions up front about what our goals should be and what our targets are, and that what the potential trade-offs are. And I don't think that we're going to have good scientific fact all the time to inform those decisions. I think sometimes it's going to be best guesses, which gets you to a second piece of it, which is the need to have an adaptive management approach. And I feel like, at least in the world that I revolve around in terms of ecosystem-based management, that the scientists are really on board for that. And maybe it's just that there's been a shift in terms of accepting the fact that we're never going to have complete information, but we do have enough information to act at this point in time, and that we need to take action and test things out and see if they work. And I know that the adaptive management is very difficult in some areas of decision making. When you have something like an LNG port, it's not going to be an adaptive management decision. You're not going to put a port in and then 30 years or 5 years from now redecide whether or not that was a good idea. Once it's there, it's there. And so maybe that's sort of just a leaping off point that we have. But in other areas, there is an ability to make decisions and make changes as you move forward in time.
Well, I think this is a good time in which to open the floor to comments and questions. We have about 20 minutes now, so if
One request,
there.
since this is being recorded, if you can please go to the microphone
Okay.
and ask your question.
Start by giving us your name, please, and then we'll go and try to be brief so that others have a chance.
My name's Ian Fine, and I was just wondering if any of the panelists had been following the California Marine Life Protection Act, which after almost 10 years is being implemented now, and whether you guys have any thoughts about that as a successful approach or a model for other states.
Drew,
Why don't you start?
Well, I'll jump in and say, the risk of sounding as a governor's appointee, like just patting the governor on the back, he really did move that process from, I don't want to say theoretical because we had been moving ahead, but really moved it ahead much more quickly. So now we've got an entire network established on the central coast of these marine protected areas, and it looks like we're going to move ahead really well in the other areas. As we're moving up to the north central coast, as we're calling it, and next we've declared that we're going to move south to Southern California from Conception to the Mexican border. So I think it's moving ahead really, really well, and it's too early to say, obviously, what the results are going to be, but the promise is very high based on what assessment has been done of other protected areas around the world. So I think it's a thing we should all be really pleased about and engaged in, because the decisions are largely made, not made in a vacuum. They're made by what people express they think they want in California. So that's a good question.
Might be worth adding as a footnote to that, that the California Sea Grant Program and the National Science Foundation have also sponsored a very expensive program for monitoring the coast and having a system of monitoring that now extends over a good deal of the coastal territory that Drew's just mentioned. So there's a scientific data collection counterpart going on. Ironically, it's the kind of synoptic data collection that the California Cal Coffee started doing back in 1949 with fisheries and ocean environment, making California current the most intensively studied long-term producer of long-term data of any comparable ocean region in the world. It's equally telling to know that about 10 years funding for that started to collapse, and that it's a tragic loss that it hasn't been continued on that basis. But the synoptic studies of this kind are expensive. And new techniques, of course, the new technology opens up a lot of possibilities that weren't there before. But once again, political, fiscal, pressure group pressures and constraints have damaged the chances. Any other comment on the Marine Protection Act?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, NRDC is very involved in it, was very involved in drafting the law and now in implementing it in the various negotiations. I think it's a great process. Marine reserves are a proven solution to some of the problems that we have with overfishing. They're one of the, I mean, in a sea of bad news about the environment that we so often find ourselves swimming in, it's really a breath of fresh air. And I think it's a great step forward for California and provides a wonderful model for other parts of the country, other coastal regions to emulate. So we support it wholeheartedly.
Okay, I think we should move to the next question. Would you give your name and go from there?
Kirsten Engel. I had a question about kind of the state approach to sort of a global, not global, but a large resource that's has national and international significance, and certainly is affected by what other countries do, as well as what the national government does. It seems like California is really pushing ahead to really try to protect the oceans, and yet it is just one state. So it sounds like California is doing a great job. I'm not from California. But I was just wondering if the commentators had, some perspective on this. What, can this be enough? What are really the main threats to sort of the sufficiency of a sort of state-oriented approach to ocean protection?
Okay, thank you. Kathryn, we'll start with you this time, if you like.
Okay. Yeah, I think that a few things. One is that states are really leading in the effort, rather than at the U.S. level, rather than our national government leading on oceans. The states have really been the ones to do it. If you look at California, California's a leader. West Coast Governors Agreement, so California, Washington, Oregon are trying to develop interstate mechanisms, collaborative approaches to managing the California current. There's different states like New York and New Jersey who developed ocean protection councils. And that extends out to 3 miles, so you've got coastal protection potentially with some federal consistency, as Joel was talking about, so that may extend out to 200 miles in some circumstances. But there are a lot of issues that are international in nature. Shipping and ballast water is an international issue that states have taken on. There are state laws in the Great Lakes, and Hawaii has a ballast water law, so they're trying to push at the international level to change whether or not ships can come into port based on their ballast water technologies. But certainly the solution is more of an international solution. Climate change, of course, the solution has to be international. And with many fisheries, there's plenty of fisheries in in national waters. I think 80% of all fisheries or something are in national waters. But as we deplete those, it's moving on to the high seas, and there's very few protections in place. So it requires this, there's local land-based uses, so you have local decisions that are affecting the oceans. It kind of runs across all things and requires all levels of government to take action.
Yeah, I jump in and say I think there are 3 ways I would look at this, the 3 ways the state has an impact. One issue we've been working on at the Ocean Protection Council involves once-through cooling, and that's where the 20-some-odd power plants in California draw in seawater, use it to cool the machines, and then discharge warmer water where the small critters that have been taken through the system have been killed. And that's something we have complete control over. The state can completely fix that problem, and I think we're on the way toward doing that. Moving up the scale from where we have a little bit less impact, salmon is an issue where we have a lot of control. We can control what happens in our state waters and what happens on land in the habitat where these fish and other anadromous fish are reared. And third is an example of where we have less control over what happens, and that's another issue Ocean Protection Council is working on, and that's marine debris. We can clean up all the marine debris, and we can stop the source of marine debris throughout California, and that is going to have a direct impact on our beaches, but probably not a huge impact internationally. However, we do have a governor who's probably as widely known as any person alive right now, and California has always been known as a leader, independent of who the players are. And so each of these things, whether it's a smaller impact or an impact we can control completely or something larger, California can play a really significant role. And finally, the governor's engaged in an agreement with the governors of Washington and Oregon for what's called the West Coast Governors Agreement to try to tackle some of these issues where obviously the borders in the ocean don't exist as they do politically. And so that's an attempt to try to expand our influence a bit directly.
The only thing I'd add to it is, it's too bad California has to be leading. I mean, obviously, something like the ocean would be better dealt with on an international basis, and certainly would be better dealt with on a national basis. But we don't have the leadership in Washington at the moment that's that we need, and we're not getting it at the international level either. So we're very lucky to have the leadership we have in California.
If I may add to that, environmentalists, like every other group with a focused interest, if the national government is controlled by a party which is consistent with its program, it's going to be nationalist. If it's the state level that's consistent with its objectives, it's going to be a states' right organization, at least on that issue. The classic example is offshore oil. Louisiana has one stance on offshore oil, and California has a very different one. If it weren't for the strong position that the states have been afforded in this area, we would probably have oil wells all up and down the California coast. Or if the California view had prevailed from the beginning, Louisiana would have no oil wells, like anything like what they have off their coast. So it's a very complicated question, and preemption at the federal level is always a possibility in many areas. One was mentioned earlier, but the most dramatic one is perhaps of all that I've ever seen, except in time of declared war, is happening right now on the Mexican border with the wall. And the suspension of the Endangered Species Act, the suspension of the Environmental Protection Act, and so on. And this is by Congress's authorization. This isn't a usurpation of power by the president. This is something he got out of Congress. And it's an exaggerated form of a larger problem. If you're going to look to the federal government for everything, you're going to get that kind of preemption. You may not like the results. So it's a mixed picture. Okay, we have another question. Give your name, please.
Yes, my name is Chris Peterson. I work for the California Coastal Commission, so I think a lot about the issues we've been talking about today. My question is sort of the flip side of the previous question, which is talking about how can you, a mere state, effectively deal with an issue as big as the problems confronting the ocean. In California, traditionally, a lot of the issues that affect at least the nearshore zones of the coast are controlled by local governments. And there you get into a lot of difficult questions about balancing the authority, the autonomy of local governments and deciding what sort of development they're going to have in their town with other sorts of environmental or other issues. And ecosystem-based management, a lot of it sounds very appealing, and then I try to think about the practicalities of doing that in a state like California, where despite an entity like the Coastal Commission, most of the authority is still in local government. So I'm just interested in what thoughts you have about that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peterson.
I
Kathryn,
can
why
launch
don't
with
you
just
come-
a brief comment on, it's something that we struggle with quite a bit.
Be brief. 'Cause we'll have other questions.
Okay. It's something we struggle with quite a bit with ocean, with ecosystem-based management. And in California, there are some good examples of small-scale efforts, and I think that one of the goals, at least, is to try to encourage local conservation and local ecosystem approaches to management. The examples that we have right now are the San Luis Obispo Science and Ecosystem Alliance. There's efforts in Elkhorn Slough and also in Humboldt Bay to try to bring together local communities and people at that level to make management decisions that protect the ocean. The challenge then becomes one of linking up with state and federal actors that have control in those areas. You can find small groups of local actors that really want to push forward on ecosystem and ocean protections, and then they have the opposite problem of trying to engage at a higher level.
Thank you.
Jump in, Harry admonished just to be brief. So two quick points. One, I would say with ecosystem-based management, which you alluded to, and every other thing we are trying, we need to challenge ourselves, whether we're policy managers at the state or elsewhere, to demand results of ourselves and say, well, what are we getting out of these various things we're trying to do? The main point, though, I think you raised, sea level rise is probably the best issue I can think of where we really have to ask that question, and I invite a conversation with you offline, because we don't have the answers, but this is the very question we're asking right now. To what extent should the state be looking at, well, the state controls a third of the coastline through state parks largely, and so we can have obviously a very large influence over those areas, but what about all the other areas, especially where development is occurring? How do we deal with the impacts of building things and the slides I showed? And they're tough questions, and again, we don't have the answers, but I think that's a key question.
Okay, Joel, you want to comment? No. Other questions? Anyone? Holly? We have a great expert on ecosystems back here. Holly DeRemus.
Well, I'm not a great expert on anything, but I'll ask a question. I was trying to sit in the back.
Professor DeRemus teaches in the field of environmental law at Davis and here at
All
Bohan.
right, so I'm Holly Dreamus, and I actually would follow up a little bit on the last question and ask more generally about the question of the issue of institutional fragmentation and how you do ecosystem-based management in a situation where, with respect to some issues, with respect to the oceans off of California, there are certainly dozens, maybe more than 100 agencies that are involved, in some places that you can find out. So do we need to radically integrate agencies? Do we need an agency that oversees the oceans altogether? Or are there ways to make all these different mission-based agencies at the state, federal, local level work together better? I'd just like to hear your takes on that general question.
Thank you very much.
I'll just start with a quick response. One of the flagship programs under the Clinton administration in the Department of Interior, run by Bruce Babbitt, was something he called Natural Communities Conservation Planning, the NCCP program.
That's actually a California program.
Yes, it is. That's right. But he sort of adopted it as his national model. And you're right. It originated under the Wilson administration, actually here in California. But the goal of that program was to get around the kind of Endangered Species Act command and control approach by creating a collaborative stakeholder process of negotiation, essentially, where you would have all the interests from local jurisdictions, from developers, from the environmental community, from the regulatory community. They would all be around the table, and they would create a regional planning system that would protect not just one species, but multiple species on an ecosystem basis. And it was a great idea, and I think it had it had and still has a lot to recommend it. It wasn't perfect by any means, but that's precisely the kind of approach that attempts to address the problem that you're asking about.
And also note that 33 years ago, the Coastal Zone Management Act was supposed to be a big step in that direction. And the history of that act and its achievements and its failures is exemplary of the difficulty of achieving real coordination and consensus on objectives. Without consensus on objectives, you're going to get agency and interest group conflict. You're not going to get, they're going to meet together, and that's going to be the coordination. They're not going to necessarily implement in a common spirit.
But that's a really good point, and I think it shows why you still need command and control, because you've got to have something that drives people to the table toward a solution. You can't just have, people are not going to get around that table and achieve results just for the conversation of it. They need to have something that keeps them there. And in the case of the NCCP, it was the Endangered Species Act that drove it. But there's always got to be a hammer to get people to the table.
Okay, we're near the end here. I don't see any hands up. Rick or Simi, do you want to make any comment at this point? Go ahead, Rick. Okay, Simi. Did you want to comment, Simi? Please.
Yeah, I guess one question that I'd like to ask is whether you think that there are technological solutions, or do new technologies help us? Do some of the better monitoring technologies, does internet conferencing, the fact that you can webcast a conference and have people all over the state participate, is that going to facilitate some of these processes and make them more practical? And maybe add transparency that drives people too.
Okay. I can say quickly in fisheries, DNA research and infrared photography made an enormous difference in knowing what biomass looks like and what migrations look like and so on. And that level of technology, there's been a great increase in information. It's not showing up in better fishery management necessarily, but the science is there in a better way.
I would say also that right now we have the IOS, or the Integrated Ocean Observing System, that at this point in time is mainly a system that collects physical and chemical information about our oceans, but there's a hire going on right now at Scripps to try to identify people who have who are developing biosensors, so that you would have real-term, constant monitoring, remote monitoring on various stations, buoys out at sea that would send information on a real-time basis for what's happening at a biological level. It's not going to tell you everything, but it certainly gets to the issue of monitoring on a regular basis. So I think technology has a huge role to play in how we understand our oceans, and the more remote type of work that we can do, the better off we're going to be.
Drew, do you want to comment?
I'd just add one point, and that is the obvious answer, I think, has to be yes. But I would suggest some caution is appropriate at looking at anything that is more complicated than what's kind of staring us in the face. The problems that we've got are fairly obvious. Some of the details, some of the mechanisms, in our lifetimes, we're not going to know all those things. But we know enough that we really ought to be moving forward on that. So I would just have a word of caution about focusing too much on that and on the problems that have been around for a long time, and they're the same, they're fundamental, and I think it's a political will issue more than it is a lack of knowledge issue.
And the last word.
Me too.
Well, we've covered everything, however briefly, from DNA to toll roads. And there's now a 15-minute break. I want to thank our speakers for their presentations. I know that some of you are going to want to take a break before the 2:45 session. I'm sure our speakers will stay for a few minutes if anyone has further questions. Thank you all.